Yeah, I think it's like lack of understanding what's actually behind the beast called cybersecurity.
Digital warfare will definitely enter the world of politics. And I think that's interesting. It shows us that the internet can affect the non-internet world. And this is a new fact, I believe, that nothing is separated anymore.
While companies want their precious data to be untouchable, you know, safe and like hidden from the eyes of the audience, still they are very much willing to have a sneak peek into the competitors and what consumers are thinking.
The hackers doesn't have to hack anymore. There will just be some sort of machine doing all the operation behind it.
So welcome back. We are, as you've noticed, running 15 minutes behind schedule, but we get the full 45 minutes of this session. And I hope it's going to be a lively one, and one to which you will be invited to contribute later. I'm going to start with actually the question that we're going to pose during this session, because I think it goes very much to the idea that nobody is immune from cyber attack. The question that you can find on your symposium app is, have you or your organization ever been hacked? And the potential answers are yes, no, and I don't know. And one of our panelists suggested that we should include in that whether you've ever received a phishing attack. That might get everyone up to 100%. So I'm going to leave it as, we're going to talk about definitions of hacking possibly in this panel, but I'm going to leave it with that open question and come back to your answers later on. It is a universal problem, though. When I was writing a recent column about cyber security, I discovered that Volkswagen last year, for example, said that it received 6,000 cyber attacks a week. Nobody is immune. The FT itself was hacked by the Syrian Electronic Army in 2013. An experience that one of my senior colleagues described as the worst experience of his journalistic career, being editor for the day that the Syrian Electronic Army comes visiting, is not something that you want to wish on anybody. So we're going to discuss the disruption that cyber threats can cause with our expert panel. I won't introduce them at length. But I'm going to start straight off by inviting Sir John Scarlett to get the discussion rolling. We'll then discuss on the panel some of the issues raised and hopefully leave a good 20 minutes or more for you to fire in your questions and observations. Sir John.
Andrew, thank you. Right, well, I'm going to very quickly run through some bullet points, machine gun style, if you like, of issues which I think sort of need to be here in the discussion and are relevant, and I'm expecting them to be expanded in the debate. Obviously, first thing, I come from the intelligence and security world, a political context, really, an international affairs context, so I look at these issues in that light. Although I now very much work in the corporate world, and of course I certainly work for corporations and organizations now that are under constant attack and spend a great deal of money protecting themselves against it. First thing to say is just that, you know, it's obvious, but it just needs repeating. As an amateur historian, I'm extremely conscious of living in an age of radical transformational change. Lots of things play into that, but the technology change is fundamental and it cuts across everything. I can't think of any area of activity or of life or existence or thought which isn't affected by it in some way or another. The second point is that this is, of course, a global issue and a global transformation, but it is not governed by any kind, really, of global rule. It's the authorities, if you like, and the governance of the digital space fundamentally rests with nation states. And nation states of many different types, with many different approaches to jurisdictional authority and principle. and increasingly, because of the overwhelming importance of the issue, are looking in many cases to assert some form of control, and we see that around us almost every day, some new development in that area. Thirdly, there's a great deal of debate in this area about the proper relationship between government and the private sector, and between sort of government concerns and responsibilities, and then individual privacy and so on. That's a very big area of debate, which of course I get involved in quite a lot. I'd simply say that certainly my experience in the UK in particular is that an effective and constructive relationship between government and the private sector is a huge asset if you can achieve it. And I think we actually in the UK are achieving quite a lot, which we jolly well ought to be, because we're spending a huge amount of money on it at a central government level. Fourthly, understanding. People talk a lot about motivation of the different actors in the cyber space, if you like, and understanding motivation. You know, people debate that a lot. Again, from my point of view, understanding the motivation behind the different forms of attack is, of course, fundamental to putting in place a capability to defend yourself against it in the future, because you can't defend yourself against something which you don't understand. And, of course, that point gets me into the sort of political, if you like, and maybe military space, because certainly, again, in my experience and to my knowledge, if we're looking for the most serious and capable forms of attack, a very high percentage, at the end of the day, come from nation states. And so they are, in effect, and by definition, in the area of national state activity. And in spite of all talk about globalization, at the end of the day, it's national rivalry and competition, confrontation, whatever it might be, cooperation, that still basically dominates the way events in the world work out. So that, of course, immediately gets into very topical areas of election interference and political interference, something which has gone on forever. And throughout my professional lifetime, including in the Cold War, before the internet age, this was something one dealt with all the time. But of course, again, now it can have a new dimension, and it appears to be potentially much more effective than it used to be in the past. That's a very interesting subject, which I'm really interested in debating. Because we talk about it such a lot, because we're learning as we go along about how it is done and what is happening, do we run the risk of exaggerating its importance? And I'll just sort of leave that on the table, because we could spend a long time discussing it, particularly 2 days off the election in France, where it is actually on the table, more or less, as an issue as I speak. And I just spent a week in the United States, and you may have noticed that it is an issue in the United States very much too. But we need to keep these things in perspective, and that's the final comment I'd make, because people talk a lot about cyber warfare, cyber threats, cyber terrorism, whatever it might be. I caution one has to be careful about using that terminology. And cyber is not a threat. It is not in itself a weapon. It is a context and an environment which allows technology and so on to be used to, as it were, give expression to threats, if you like, or competition, or even military conflict, which exists anyway. It's just an additional dimension that one has to understand, and that actually is true also for terrorism. But I'll stop there.
Just one follow-up question. You mentioned the French elections. Can we describe what has happened to Emmanuel Macron, who has obviously faced at least the allegation that he had offshore accounts timed, apparently, at the moment that he was debating Marine Le Pen? Does that constitute a cyber attack, or is it more of a social media influencing operation? Or are the two things
well,
not distinguishable?
On the basis of what I've seen so far, and of course that is working itself out now, and I didn't actually watch the debate. I wish I had intended to, but I was actually thinking about what I was going to be saying here, so I'll blame Gallen for that. But clearly I've read about it afterwards, and I've been following the election in France very carefully because I've got property there. I want to know what's going on. It looks to me like a classic case of all the techniques coming together, if you like, of sort of state-sponsored, more or less open media linked to fake news, linked to transmissions through trolls and bots and into retweets, and then given maximum profile. Because if you're only 3 or 4 days off the election, if you want to get a story out, you've got to get it out. And it has the profile of being referred to in the presidential debate, which I must say I was surprised about, and I strongly suspect will backfire.
Right.
So in other words, if you misuse or are not careful enough about how you use this kind of technique, it backfires against you. And that might also be, actually, in the longer term, what we conclude about the impact of the election interference in the United States.
Okay. Thanks very much for that great overview. I should have mentioned before we started that I think on your program you had Ilya from Russia as one of the panelists. He's unable to make it, as you've already spotted, although for all I know, given his skills, he is listening in somewhere in Russia. Let me pass it on to Shira, please.
As an Israeli, I will not comment on the Russian absence of this panel, but I'll let your imagination go wild. I'm Shira Kaplan. I'm the founder and CEO of Cyverse AG. We're a cybersecurity firm based out of Lake Zurich. And what we do is we bring state-of-the-art technologies and services coming out of the Israeli market, which is very cyber-aware and cyber-secure, and we bring it out to global corporations. And our headquarters is here in Lake Zurich. I am Israeli. I was previously a cyber and intelligence analyst in a unit which Mr. Scarlett knows very well called 8200, which is the elite technology unit of the Israeli intelligence. So this is the background. Will you?
Well, it's not a secret, actually.
He likes me much more now, or less. I'll make just a few kind of opening statements, and bear in mind that my direction is more on the corporate, organizational side rather than the military. I'm not going to comment too much on anything that's military related. I'll leave it to you. First of all, the first thing we have to bear in mind is that cybersecurity is moving to the forefront of our everyday life because everything is getting connected. And by 2018, we're going to have over 20 billion devices connected to the internet, and that connectivity means vulnerability. Yep. So everything we can think of, from our phones to our wallets to our financial systems to our nuclear plants, is going to be connected to the internet. And that means a big risk. And this is why you're hearing about cybersecurity time and time again. Now, the second point I want to mention is you as company leaders, organization leaders, board members, you have to assume that your company, your organization, your network has been breached. Yep. This is the new assumption in the area of cybersecurity. This is the philosophical underlying assumption. And I'm quoting here the Chief Information Security Officer of IBM, who says, assume breached. And the question is, how quickly can you detect what is crawling in your system? And how can you minimize the damage? Whether it's a reputational damage, financial damage, and so on. So this is the second point I want to make. The third point I want to make is that I challenge CEOs and CIOs to think about their organizations not as banks or insurance companies or industrial manufacturers, but rather as IT companies. Your bank is an IT company, your insurance is an IT company, and you are running an IT business. And since this is the case, you cannot treat IT as a silo anymore. So having the head of IT or the head of cybersecurity sitting somewhere in a basement or in a dark room is not a good idea. If you're running an IT business, you need to have your CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, if you have one. You need to get them heard, because security, IT security is a central part of your organization. Now, one other point I just want to make, or let me make a couple more. Cybersecurity is not just about cybercrime and defending your organization from the theft of data and so on. It's also about business continuity. So when you protect yourself against cyber attacks, you also allow your business to run more smoothly. And that's something we need to remember. And the last point I want to make is that, and we talked about this before, Andrew, is cybersecurity, or the language of cybersecurity, should not be the domain or the realm of techies, technologists, or IT specialists. This is a language that all of us who are living in the 21st century need to speak. If we know how to live in a physically secure world where we put a lock on our door and an alarm system to our cars or to our home, well, this is exactly the same thing, except in the virtual domain and in the digital domain. So we all need to speak the language of cybersecurity. It is not a scary language. It is not complicated to understand it. And I think this is something that has to kind of be digested by leaders who are taking organizations to the digital level. So with this, I'll leave it here. And
thank you. Yes, I mean, I think we can debate a little bit later the issue of the human side of this, because since time immemorial, even pre-technology developments, it's been human weaknesses that attackers and others who want to disrupt have wanted to exploit. So it's a human problem as much as it is a technology problem. Lance, please tell us where you're from and what your...
I was looking at that code first. That's also a bad idea to put actual code inside of JSON, but that's another thing. Being human again, yet again. Yeah, I'm Lance James. I'm chief scientist at Flashpoint. Good evening, everybody. I mean, morning. My time. So I head up R&D over at Flashpoint, and also the InfoSec, because it's a company this size where you do what you got to do. Besides that, prior to that, I was head of cyber intelligence for Deloitte, off an acquisition, and then before that, I was yet again chief scientist in another company, built out their threat intelligence. But what's more important is not what's on the surface of my resume. It's more important that the work I've done in the background, in the back channels, has been focusing on bridging, as John has said, is bridging the industry with law enforcement, or IC, as well. So at work, for instance, I'm the liaison. IC? Oh, intelligence community. Right. So at work, I liaison those communications, which is a very, very difficult problem, because there's a lot of legal implications for companies even talking. But at the same time, that relationship is very important. You don't want to call if you're in the US, you don't want to call the FBI after the problem has happened. You want to have a relationship. And it's not this spooky, everybody just walks in the door and starts searching your computers. It's a little bit different than that, with that relationship in place. So that my work has been done, a lot of that. I've partaken in a lot of international takedowns, including CryptoLocker, Silk Road, a few other things. Working and bridging that, pieces together, chasing bad guys, kind of a Sherlock Holmes type tales. But at the same time, really, it had to do with the community together, working on solving these problems. And there were a lot of people that did not know the language of, per se, cyber, but they knew the language of, say, risk management, or they knew the language of law enforcement, and we kind of worked in bridging that together. So when we deal with concepts of digital warfare, to complement both of you, Cyber is a domain. Again, don't be afraid of it, but cyber, land, air, space, sea, cyber. The term cyber actually came from military terminology, actually. It was cyberspace, but it was used when it was talking about certain type of intelligence and such. And the world that some of us work in would be called cyber counterintelligence, which is really what cybersecurity in many ways is today. It is trying to make sure someone doesn't steal your information outside of your company. Well, if you look at the term counterintelligence, that is the same exact thing. And so we have this breed now that we see this burgeoning effect that there's intelligence meets information security. You get hackers with intel analysts are starting to become a thing, right? And so where I work, that's a common thing now, and it's something that's really fun, right? You try to get, you marry those two together, you have a very creative room of people going on. And so, so when we look at this, though, it really comes down to there are parts of the area that are difficult and technical, like knowing the difference, can you spot that there's a problem in that code, right? Or things like that. That's one piece, but this really is a people problem. Doesn't matter what that code is. The fact is humans, we're human, and we are layer 8. There's 7 layers in the computer OSI model, but we are layer 8, which is we are the humans at the end of the keyboard. We're not about bits and bytes. We just happen to be using them. But we are completely interactive. 20 years ago, computers kind of worked by themselves. They did their own things most of the time. But now, everything we do is interactive. What is the most popular tool you're using? Your phone and what? Your email, right? And we're always on the go. We're always hitting that button. We have to. And I always hear people say, oh, but don't click links on the internet. Well, then I won't use the internet. And that's really what the problem is that we need to start stepping back and learning, hey, there are some aspects of this problem that is hard. There are some aspects that have been introduced even to information security experts called operational security that we didn't know before this. That comes from the intelligence world, where you're having to protect, even information security experts now have to protect themselves because they are the target. Because they're like, CISOs will be the target because if the adversary can have them fired, they get even a bigger advantage. And then there's also the thing that you brought up. There was you talk about business continuity, and I love that because when people ask me about ransomware, how many people have ever had to deal with ransomware in some way or another? Whether it's it's okay, I have to, so don't worry. So when you look at that, people are worried about it. Oh my gosh, it's a new thing. And there's a lot of media hype on anything that's new. It's like stunt work, right? And that can put us into a panic. I like the whole Douglas Adams thing, don't panic, right? And security companies, we try to do that too. We try to get you to panic. Why? So that you'll buy something from us, right? And that, we're kind of ruining this industry in some ways that we do this. And this is dangerous. All of us being yet again human, right? And reactionary to a problem. But ransomware, for instance, people ask, how do you solve that? I said, the same way you solve a server's hard drive from going down. It's disaster recovery. Right? It doesn't need to be anything new. You don't need to panic. You just step back and look at what your strategy is with how do you handle risk, right? So when you kind of look at digital warfare today, and we go back to that real quick, it is overhyped. It doesn't mean that it's not a concern, but it is overhyped in the sense of commerce has gotten in the middle of, like, there's these swim lanes that changed in 2011, I'd say, where you have nation-state actors, and then you have commercial security companies identifying them and then kind of exposing them, which also expedited some of the attacks themselves. For instance, the OPM breach in America was expedited because China has now got a big spotlight on them, and if they had to basically get in and get out. But it's not really a cyber attack. In the traditional intelligence espionage game, you just call that espionage, right? So we overhype some of this stuff, and we act like it's never gone on before. It's just gone on slightly different. Again, different domain. But now this domain connects everything. It scares us. Now, the last thought I had on this, we talk about assume you're breached. So I started in cryptography when I was young. That was my area. And one of the things that I loved was threat modeling. The idea of, who's your adversary? Where is your information? What are your secrets you're protecting, and who are your actors involved, right? This is how you kind of establish those risks, right? And when I looked at it, I loved cryptography because I had to assume, okay, I'm not going to assume that I can defend myself against the NSA, right? And when I built like a cryptography paradigm, I accepted certain risks. And so when I think about that, assuming you're compromised, in cryptography you have to. Right? That was the idea. That's what I liked about it, is that I assumed that I was in a hostile environment. Now, how do I build something that I can still work and do business in? Well, the internet is the wild, wild web, right? You are in a hostile environment. Now, how do you build, if you change that mind of thinking that it's not always adversaries, but it's your competition, if you thought about it from a competitive intelligence, you'd spend the money, right? You see what I'm saying? So it's the same thing. Data is bacon. Everybody wants data, period. Its content is currency, no matter what field you're in, media, threat intelligence, espionage, whatever it is. It's all about content and its currency today. It is data. So when you look at it, just look at it as, okay, there are people out there that want my data, right? So how do I start addressing that? I'm on the wild, wild web. I want to protect my data. You had a good point about the home security. I'd like to take it even a layer deeper. If someone burglarizes your home, you have to accept that as a risk. The difference is, did you store your jewelry or the high values in your home, or did you put it somewhere else that was actually, in a safe box, deposit box? So that's the question, is someone, you go through your home and you manage your risks by saying, I don't want that in my home because it might get stolen. And so that's how you kind of take that. So that's my thoughts.
Okay, great. I've got lots of questions. I'm going to actually go straight to the audience, though, because I'm sure you have as well, and I don't want to waste the time that we have on my particular insights, which are those of an amateur. One point that you raised, though, about the national actors, one of the fun anecdotes that I heard when I was looking into this a few months ago was that the reality of knowing that that they are national actors who are attacking your company or your organization. Somebody told me, and maybe, Sir John, you know whether this is true or not, that it was detectable partly because at lunchtime in whichever country was doing the attack, the civil servants who were doing the attacking all knocked off for their lunch break, and you could tell from the reduction in
well, that is definitely one of the ways in which you can begin to attribute the original source of attacks. And that's particularly true if you're facing an apparently organized crime or criminal group attacker, which are very often, increasingly, in fact, it's clear that they're linked, or they can be linked, with nation states, and then you can track it back to government service working hours. That definitely happens.
Right. Let's go to the audience. Can we have a look while we put the lights up at what the outcome is of the poll that I announced earlier, or are we going to manage to see that? So 47%. I think actually the significant figure on that is the don't know. Yeah. I was struck by something I read, and maybe this is out of date, but that it takes on average 99 days, I think, for organizations to discover that they have suffered a breach. 99 days. So you may not know, but you probably have been hacked. So questions. Let's see who's got one. Yes, gentleman here on the third row we'll start with. Could you say who you are and where you work?
Right, thank you. My name is Juhani Hintikka. I run a software company. I'm from Finland. I have a question maybe to all of you panelists. There is a new way of combating cyber threats emerging, white hat hacking with bug bounty programs. And there are companies like HackerOne in the US that have already 100,000 hackers working for the good guys and getting a reward from the companies. They've been asked by the Pentagon to try and hack into Pentagon, and they've done so and given their recommendations. Can you give your perspective on how important this is, and is this actually the way to combat this, rather than trying to keep up with updating your systems and hoping they work?
Okay,
thank you.
Good question. Lance, you're wearing a black hat. I'm taking that's not significant.
Sorry, I love this question. A friend of mine, Katie Mazouris, is actually the person who really engineered. She worked at Microsoft and started the whole bug bounty there, and she's kind of engineered the entire process, and we got the DoD, the Pentagon, to do a new challenge to do the same. This idea, I literally wrote a foreword for a friend's book, and I had literally covered this subject and how I love the incentive driver to this. So the problem with security and cybersecurity is, for the longest time, the security office of any place is always the enemy of the company or the organization, because it's like, they're going to say, no, I don't want to go to them. I don't want to go to them, right? And this has changed that. There was a big problem is people like me, when I'm younger, I've learned to adapt and become an executive. But when I'm younger, like, being understood and not feared was a big problem. You got hackers like me that know how to break things, right? But in our hearts, we're not like, we want to break your stuff. We're just like, hey, we want to fix it, but we'll get in trouble if we try to explain that, or they'll misunderstand it. There's all this legal stuff we never knew as younger kids. Right? And this is a fact. We've seen this grow, and we've seen researchers attacked and things like this because there's a misunderstanding. Not that both sides think they're the good guys, but they're both just trying to protect their interests. So what HackerOne and what all these companies have done, I think, is actually it's game theory. right? And what they've done is they have incentivized, and everybody, the whole model of Nash, everybody wins, right? And what they've done is they've given freelance hackers that maybe don't, you know, maybe they can't get a clearance, or maybe they can't do this, but they can do a good job at what they do. And they can go and freelance and make money and have a living by doing what they love to do, they're passionate about, and they get paid for it finally, right? And it shows an effort also on the company that they're making efforts to actually bridging that gap and working with them on their terms so that they don't have to manage necessarily the X factor or the egos or anything that we have in our industry, which we do. So I think actually this has been a beautiful, beautiful concept. It isn't perfect. But it is something that most companies have been going towards because of that, to that incentivizing. Both sides have a huge incentive, and it controls it well with an escrow service right in the middle. So it's
how do you verify that the white hat hacker is indeed a white hat and not a black hat?
So there's a crowdsourcing system there for vetting that. A lot of them work in working groups, right? So I actually had an idea for this same platform, but for attribution, meaning like, can we go after some bad guys and stuff like this at the same way for cybercrime, not necessarily nation state. But basically what it is it's reputations. Almost all reputation systems tend to work. What I mean by that is you can say 5 stars, this guy's done this before, this guy has done this before. And there's also criminal background checks on some of these systems.
So you're saying there's a 4 to 5, there's a 5-star rating system for white hat hackers?
Yes, there is. So when it comes to bug bounties and stuff like that, yes, they have a reputation based on their previous work. You got to remember the incentivizer is also that they get a good name. Right? They got to break Microsoft's XYZ or IBM's XYZ, right? And when they get that, they get their own fame out of that, not just the money, right? Okay. And so that's a black hat conference for them. They get to talk and be a kind of a star, right? There's a bit of this rock star mentality that we have in our industry, and this plays into that and validates them. So yeah,
we'll take another question from the floor if there's anybody who wants to. Yes, lady on the 3rd row here, right in the middle. What happened to the microphones? Oh, they've gone right to the back. No, it's coming.
It's coming.
Just here.
Someone.
Could you put your hand up just to indicate? Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm just wondering what you make of...
Could you just say who you are and where you're from?
Nicola Plummer. So I'm from Canada at the University of Toronto, where the Citizen Lab is, actually. So I'm just wondering what you make of or what you think of quantum computing, quantum cryptography, and quantum key distribution and the power to disrupt cryptography and signals intelligence.
Okay. Who'd like to take that? I don't think I'm qualified to.
Well, if I can just very quickly take it in a fairly general way, I went on a sort of a bit of a course about quantum computing in Cambridge a month ago, and I came away quite shocked by it, overwhelmed by what I was hearing.
Can you sum up in a sentence what it is for those of us who are not
it's the
classified expert?
It's the sheer scale of the capability that it represents. It gets us into a different level of capability and activity. And since we're talking about the dynamic effects on us all from what's happened so far, to think that very quickly this is coming is. I was self-examining. So, well, why didn't I have some better idea of this before?
So what is it in a word?
You say,
Shira?
Okay.
Or Lance?
But in a word.
In a word.
It's like a hot potato cut in between there.
No.
Okay.
So interesting thing about quantum, we're in a state where it's not can this happen, it's when will something happen, no matter what. That's why we are in the age of disruption. It takes us, 10,000 years to evolve to one thing, and suddenly we have, 10 years ago, we have iPhones everywhere, and we can't stop looking at them, right? So same with, let's start about cryptography for a second and encryption.
Can we do it just as concisely as
yes,
you can?
I promise you.
What
the real
is
problem is everybody's
computing?
scared of encryption right now. We're going back to that problem. In quantum, I'm excited about it. From one side of it is that it's great. We're improving on our problems, our mathematics. On the other side of it, people are scared of it. But the problem is like for those who work in intelligence and understand that there's a lot of data points, encryption is not something that should be scared of. It should be embraced because there is more good to it than bad in many cases, especially the mathematics and the discoveries we'll have with it. So.
Lance, what is it? I'm still...
What is what? Sorry. Quantum cryptography?
Quantum cryptography.
Quantum
quantum
we have to do the whole Canadian, your prime minister did something with this in physics. Quantum cryptography is basically, it's the next generation. I don't know how to explain it without getting into physical math here, but it's basically like photons, basically, and stuff going back and forth. It's light-based cryptography, which is Going to be phenomenal. Now, one thing in the warfare side of this, though. Yes, if you want to go ahead, please.
Basically, a computer, kind of, the language of computers is
zeros and ones, yeah.
Yes.
Whereas in quantum computing, you can look at it in
multiples of yes.
So you can calculate things at an exponential rate
Yep.
in a way that you can't in computers.
Yeah, it's basically 10x order of magnitude.
It's a multiplication of the...
Yeah, it's basically, yes.
So it increases the security of cryptography.
It increases the speed, it increases our capabilities. Everything we talk about going, oh, you can't solve that in a million years, it'll be in billions of years, right?
Right,
It's multitudes of magnitude or order.
We've got there.
Oh,
Okay,
well done.
Excellent.
Well done.
Thank you.
So.
Thank you. Okay, another question. Yes, lady here on the second row.
What is it?
Annalisa Piras, director of the Wake Up Foundation. Just to bring it to maybe a more intelligible level, in terms of political technology, we've heard quite a lot about Russia being very advanced in interfering in political systems abroad with the cyber warfare. And I hear that apparently, but I'm not sure this is where I would like your views, Europe is completely unprepared to deal with this kind of interference and attacks. How worried should we be that our political systems can be undermined and sabotaged by powers like Russia? Thank you.
Sir John, obviously in your sweet spot.
Well, as I hinted at in my comments, I think we just need to be careful before, when we comment on this, because we can get into a panic attack, very quickly, partly because we're only learning now, really, the way in which it works. And although I might be the last person to say this, it's slightly unfair on Russia that it gets so much attention here because, they're not the only people who do it. That's the first thing. It's a natural extension of state activity and state influence activity, if you like. There's nothing illogical about it. It's simply responding to the capabilities, technical capabilities and so on, and their consequences, which are out there. And the fact is, as I know very well from my past, there's a very long history of Russian or Soviet interference or attempts to interfere in Western liberal democracy processes. By and large, the success rate of this has been virtually zero, certainly in Western liberal democracies. And once we understand better the way in which it is actually happening, and that process is going on as I speak, because inevitably you end up, something is happening, some new process underway, you watch it and you work it out and you get to understand it and then you can deal with it. There's a very good study written, published earlier this year by the Sweden's Institute of International Affairs, which gives a lot of examples and goes into sort of really good detail as to the way it has actually been working. In fact, that's the best composite study that I've come across. The reality is that elections in big Western or healthy Western liberal democracies are complicated things. They've got their own dynamics. And at the end of the day, almost certainly, the way they go and the result is because of their own internal workings of the electoral system, whether it's in the UK, France, Germany, or wherever. But clearly, you have to have confidence in the system. And if confidence is weakened because it looks like there's distortion going on, even if people don't understand the distortion and they don't understand the way it's done and they're prone to exaggerate it and so on, the mere fact that they're no longer completely confident in the outcome is itself a weakening effect. And that's actually that could be a problem in the United States.
Shira, just on the broader point, beyond the politics, sitting where you do and looking at Europe, how vulnerable do you think European organizations are to cyber threat? I mean, I know we're all being reassured not to panic and to be to be calm about it. I'm feeling a rising pulse rate as the panel progresses.
Well, cyber threats from what? I mean, here we're talking.
Well, we're talking about national
specific issue of outsider interference in the electoral process, which is obviously a sort of fundamental and basic feature of the society in which we live. So on that specific issue, clearly it's such an important issue that we must be sure that we are doing everything we can to protect against it. And to understand it, and then to discuss it in a sort of rational, careful way. I think that's what that's what I'm saying.
Are we prepared?
Well, much better prepared than we were, 2 or 3 years ago. But
we're not prepared.
Well, no.
Don't panic, though.
No. Honestly, look. Where did cyber capability or this kind of capability come from in the first place? It came from the United States and the UK. That's where its origins are. That's where the capabilities are, and they're within the state mechanisms of those two countries in particular. Israel's done a bit more recently.
Okay.
So don't think that we are helpless. We're not.
I know Israel has something to say about this.
Shira, do you want to chip in with a
I just wanted to say you're asking an Israeli how we view European security, and we are a paranoid nation, so I think our view is a little bit distorted. But the truth is that we see unpreparedness. If we're talking to organizations, be it banks or pharmaceutical companies, and especially if they're not tier 1, but they're tier 2, I would say the level of awareness is still not there. And if we focus on a geography like Switzerland, which is where we started our activity, that's even more kind of observable, because there's something about the Swiss mentality that is about being protected by mountains, except there are no mountains in the cyber domain. So it's always a challenge to, and Switzerland is all about security and safety, but I think there has to come, we have to move a little bit further in the understanding that we are under some kind of attack, and that cybersecurity awareness needs to just go up just a little bit. And I'm talking about Switzerland, but also the extended greater Europe. So
John,
I hope I haven't offended you.
I just briefly wanted to come back.
Make it clear, I'm talking there about the political context and elections and so on. I'm not talking about the preparedness of companies. I know perfectly well that the great majority are not prepared. I think that's the point I'm trying to make.
Thank you for the clarification. We'll just take one more question, and then we're out of time. If there is another question, yes, the lady on the far left of the auditorium there.
Can you pass it through, please?
As brief as you can be, if you can.
Yes, thank you very much for everything so far. If I may bring it back to the
Could you say who you are?
Corporate world. I'm sorry. My name's La Fischer. I thought I ran a bank. I may be running an IT company.
Yes, you surely are.
But one question is, I mean, there are all kinds of risks. There's earthquake risk, there's all kinds of risks that we're faced with, fire risk. I mean, anything can happen. And there are, in the meantime, in our world, there are sort of accepted best practices. If you happen to be in Tokyo, the expected best practice for building your building will be different than if you happen to be somewhere where there are no earthquake risks. You can also buy insurance for that type of risk. And the price of that insurance is a good benchmark for how much you should be spending to protect against that risk. How close are we, in the opinion of the panel, to getting to that place with respect to cyber risk? At the moment, it seems to
pricing risk properly, you mean?
Pricing it, being able to buy insurance, having some consensus as to how much we should be spending protecting against it.
Thank you. Lance, quickly. Just very briefly from each of you on this. I think it's
that's actually
a way to wind up.
If we solve that problem soon, that's going to be great. There is cyber insurance out there. There are these actuaries trying to put numbers on risk. It's very independent events. And so, for instance, I can't say, hey, Zeus getting on your computer and taking all your data might be the same. But I have learned that certain, like, for instance, transportation companies, an hour of DDoS of them outage cost them $45 million an hour, right? So people are starting to put those numbers together. And the problem is where, we see regulations causing an incentive. So we are hoping, obviously, insurance will also add to that. how soon are we there? We're closer than we were before. The way I see it is similar to are we prepared or not? This is that process of getting us prepared. Okay. Right now we're in that state where it's like in the old days of war, we're the castles and gunpowder just got invented. The adversaries have gunpowder, and so we're reacting and we're dealing with that painful process of switching over to an agile perspective, but we're still kind of healing away.
Okay, thank you. Shira?
I think it's a great question, and part of the problem that I see is that organizations are doing cybersecurity audits or assessments that are meant to tick the box, rather than to really protect themselves. And I think that when organizations start taking real experts to protect themselves, it will be much easier for the insurers to price that correctly. I've had a conversation this week with a large insurance company, and I couldn't believe my ears how low the cyber risk premium was for a small business. And I said, you know, a company's paying 350 francs a year to get a cybersecurity insurance if it's a small business. But one day of a security expert's costs over 2,000 francs. So how are you going to stay in the green zone where you're not losing as a cyber insurance company?
Right.
So I think that the risks are mispriced, and I think they can be accurately priced by doing real cybersecurity assessments, and we call that hands-on security assessments.
Okay, so John, a final thought?
It's a very good question. You work for a bank, not an insurance company. Yeah.
Plenty of people working for insurance companies here as well.
I know. I absolutely realize that. It's a fundamental issue, obviously, for the insurance industry and different aspects of the insurance industry. If we are right in saying, as we all have said, that this is a sort of transformative process and movement that is underway, which is all-embracing and global and so on, clearly it's a sort of, you can't use quite the language which we use about earthquakes and natural disasters and so on for this, because it transcends sort of almost everything. And therefore we need to think about it and get our brains around it in a different way. And that's partly why I resist the word cyber, because it categorizes it, doesn't help us understand what we're talking about. And of course the insurance industry is clearly working hard now to understand this.
Great. Well, thank you to the panel for helping us get our brains around it this morning. I can't resist mentioning, if Sir John permits, that when he handed in his coat and bag this morning, the tag that he was handed had the number 007 on it. So somebody in the...
Show this. This is amazing.
Somebody has a sense of humor. Ladies and gentlemen.
If I may congratulate St. Gallen on their sense of humor.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank our panel.